Hi, I'm David with EV World News. We talk about electric vehicles, green energy, and the stock markets. And on today, we have a special guest. Besides having our resident engineer, Mike Herzog, we have David Kiewlich, who's a PhD in cell developmental biology. But we're going to talk about some things going on in the energy space, obviously. Anyways, David, welcome to our show.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, David.
Yeah, so you and I met by doing the Super Green Live 3-day event that was on E360 TV. And that was organized a little bit by, what was it, Super Crowd and Green to Gold. Now, were you affiliated with Green to Gold?
We are almost ready to finalize our strategic alliance, so yes.
Okay, I mean, I wasn't sure because a lot of people were brought by Devin Thorpe from Super Crowd. You were probably a Devin. I was brought, I've known Alan Tratner for a few years, and I've been involved in a lot of green to gold projects. So um, I was just kind of curious. But green to gold is an incubator in the green space, and you run an incubator is it in the biology space?
Partially. So, yeah, I've been doing the incubation for about almost 7 years now, and our verticals are human health and planetary health. But the planetary health side really has been quite interesting to see all the different varieties of options to be able to, solve some of the world's problems. And it's really going to be a multifactorial solution, right? There is no one silver bullet. We created a big mess and now we've got to solve it. But we're going to solve it by taking little bites out of it. The old adage of how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. So, in our space, we have, a huge variety of different things, some of which are biological, many of which are not. And so it's been kind of an interesting experience.
But are you in the Bay Area?
We have locations in the San Francisco Bay Area, Salt Lake City, Utah, and Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Oh, okay. But that certainly keeps you busy.
It's just exciting as a scientist to be surrounded by so much science and so many exciting ideas, and the option to be able to support all of this and help it get to the marketplace is very compelling.
Well, I was really intrigued because you and I have a lot of similar thought paths. Like I have this whole thing I talk about I'm on a quest to end energy poverty because I consider energy to be the real wealth. Without energy, there's no finances. Money really doesn't matter a whole lot, right? At least not in the modern society. People traded gold for thousands of years, right? But as far as our current system, countries are wealthy because they have energy 24/7. And the poor countries don't have energy 24/7. But you were taking it to a different step. You were looking at our domestic use. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure, real quick. And I'd love for Mike to chime in as well. But one of the things that really interests me is looking at many of the cities and small towns throughout the US. They oftentimes were driven by sort of an external economic driver, like a mine or a manufacturing plant or a distribution center, something like that. And a large corporation usually runs that, and that ends up being the economic driver that then creates a small town or small city around it for all the support services for the people working in that plant or that mine. And so you end up with, housing and schools and restaurants and hospitals and everything else just to support that event. Unfortunately, almost always those economic drivers eventually close. The mine runs out, the distribution plant maybe gets moved overseas. This is quite common. But the town itself no longer has the self-sufficiency to keep its economics going. And so it kind of decays, but it doesn't die. It just sort of withers away. And I think that ends up creating a hopelessness because people just realize that they've been left behind and kind of forgotten. And I think that creates a lot of stress, but it also creates sort of this fatalism that, my way of life is over and there's no options. We need to fix that. We need to take it more seriously. And what I think could be a really powerful effort is energy generation, because the world needs pretty much as much energy as we can possibly produce. And this gives that economic driver revitalizing that town by creating that energy source that then can be used for data centers or micro manufacturing or a wide variety of additional services and industries. But to your point, everything relies on power. If you don't have it, you can't do anything. And when you do have it, it unlocks quite a wide variety of options. But really, also, the cost of that power is almost always the limiting factor of what we want to do. Right? Things are economically viable because of the cost of the energy to be put into that system. So if we can find a way to generate that energy at greater volume at lower cost, then that will also unlock a wide variety of other options that can then domino into real solutions to solve, climate and planetary health. And so looking at these cities and saying, what can we do to bring this revitalization back in and then expand that to produce industrial effort because of the availability of the power locally, I think could, solve 2 or even 3 different problems simultaneously.
Yeah,
Nice.
it's a really interesting perspective, and I hadn't thought about it from that viewpoint before, where effectively it sounds like you are using energy and power as a commodity and repurposing that back in from whatever widget that town produced before, however they produced that before. We can fill that gap back in with energy, as the commodity. People who watch this regularly, no surprise, David and I are in the middle of the country. Right smack, throw a dart, you're going to hit the middle of the country. You're going to be pretty close to us. So that's a daily reality of life. We're in an urban center, but you go 50 miles in any direction and it's very visible. The town and impact. And I'd throw onto yours highway, interstate, or even railroad. That's a lot of development that we've seen where passenger railroad lines really don't go very far, and those towns kind of start to wither away when that starts to happen. So that idea of we can refocus, we can add that excess generation, because it is such a scarcity right now, in the micro scale and the macro scale. It's just nobody has it. Everybody wants it. Nobody has it. And really refocusing on that with a prioritization in that space, it's really, really interesting. But yeah, it's a great perspective.
Well, thank you. And I would also say that it doesn't necessarily limit to just the US. If you can imagine this as a useful tool, pretty much the entire planet then becomes an option where areas that have either been left behind technologically or for various societal reasons, creating that energy as a commodity to provide value to drive everything locally, can revitalize virtually any part of the planet. And so, while we may start here just because investment might be easier to come by, fundamentally, there's no reason why we would limit that just to the US.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And what we see from the grid side and grid planning side, it's a complete inversion, of the system from the way it's operated for 150 years, where you had centralized generation that's transmitted and then distributed. Now we've flipped that on its head, with distributed energy resources and how that's going. It's becoming much more prevalent and really more efficient, more effective. Throw whatever other adjective you want in there. If you localize that power to the source, and because of reduced costs, because of just technology, the way it's advanced, it's feasible. I mean, that is truly a feasible option today.
Now, David, you've been looking at some technologies that would create jobs in the energy space. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. And that's the idea of, we could imagine these being certainly not a single source. You would have multiple sources for this, both renewables such as geothermal, solar, wind, etc. But then, for example, in my incubator right now, I have a Gen 4 nuclear reactor company called Kairos Power. They're generating these small module reactors where they can be built off-site and then trucked in to where they need to be run. And they're, between 50 megawatts and 150 megawatt sources. That's enough to run a modest city. And so you'd have that stability of power. And then you add to it, battery banks or some other storage mechanism for the renewables so that you flatten out that curve. Because obviously renewables aren't working all the time. And so you end up with, these weird sort of demand and supply curves that don't really line up most of the time. But you can smooth that out with both nuclear, possibly geothermal, because that's always on, but also with battery storage or some other energy storage. Pumped water is a good one. Molten sodium is another one. There are different ways you could do that. And by creating that ability to eliminate the need for peaker plants, right, which are easily the most inefficient systems to generate electricity. They're expensive to maintain. They're not used very often. They have lower regulations, so they typically are much dirtier and less efficient. If we can get rid of even just that little part, that would be enormously beneficial in the long term. And so that's the idea, is let's look at it from multiple different ways, and that creates all of those jobs. And then once you do that, you end up with a commodity value that then creates abilities to do other things, such as manufacture. Let's say you want to do drones or vertical gardens or whatever else you want to do. Then you have the power now to be able to support all of that. And this could also be used for data centers, et cetera, right? Pretty much game on when it comes to what you would support. Fundamentally, everything is limited by the availability of power and i.e. electricity.
One of the things as I've looked at different types of power generation, the one that seems to be the most job intensive, or it has the most employees, whatever, would be like waste to energy, because it does imply a certain amount of sorting the materials so that they're processed the right way. And for example, one of the guys we've been working with on a prospective waste to energy project, he's estimating creating about 200 jobs. And it's like, that's a lot of jobs, for an energy plant. Whereas when we look at nuclear, you have the construction and all of that, but long term, you maybe get a couple people.
Exactly. I think the energy generation is, sorry, I apologize.
I'm just saying, not talking about a lot of job creation, but waste energy was one that really, in and of itself, creates some jobs. And so, yeah, but on the flip side, when you have excess energy, then somebody's going to want to figure out a way to use it, right? Typically.
Exactly.
I mean, at the moment we're so energy starved. I saw some statistic that Texas is going to have to triple its energy production by 2040. So in the next 14 years, they have to triple their energy production to accommodate everything. Now, that being said, there's all these off-grid setups where people are coming in, and one of them is it's over 8 gigawatts off-grid for a data center setup. It's the biggest that I've seen so far. And mind you, it's off-grid, but there's still a natural gas pipeline running to the property, right? So it's sort of off-grid if you don't count the natural gas pipeline. So it's not. It has 500 megawatts of solar, which is a really big solar farm, and battery storage, but it's 7.65 gigawatts of natural gas usage. And if you think about that, I mean, what would that support? 4 million homes, 16 million, 15, 16 million people, if it was in a city. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, that would support Houston by itself, and it's just crazy to see it. But I'm not so sure that the way they're doing it, it's really going to create a lot of jobs. The data centers, while they bring investment, because I see these things like, we're bringing billions of dollars of investment to Texas for this data center, but it's not creating a whole lot of jobs. The data center, as enormous as it is, might create 100 jobs, for billions having been invested in it. They're not, this is one of the things, and we talk about AI and how it makes everything better. I love AI and all that, but in theory, as we go along, like AI and robots, taking jobs, and it's not necessarily that there's not going to still need to be people in certain positions. They're just going to be providing. You're going to need less of them. So when you have your experts, you'll need fewer experts, right, to oversee what's going on. And so, but at the same time, that AI is using massive energy. So it's kind of this, spiraling. A lot of the projects like Mike and I have looked at, we're looking at where somebody has a need to bring in manufacturing. And so inherently it's producing jobs. And I tell people, I've even had real estate developers, they want to talk about how could we build a community around like a smaller modular, much smaller than the Kairos ones, let's say like a 15 to 20 megawatt reactor. And I'm like, you have to have manufacturing, you have to have jobs. I mean, you can have the homes. If you have the homes, there's going to be people, in the services businesses, right? And there's going to be a grocery store and all that. But ultimately, you want something that is a job hub for that community. And so I've looked at it kind of a little, I don't know, it's a similar, but, slightly different lens. Now, you were talking about, was it biomass you were discussing on the TV show?
Yes, that was one option, and that's that the gasification that you were referring to, sort of using municipal waste, because we know every city, town, etc., produces municipal waste. I mean, that's just how it works. And historically, that's been treated as sewage and then disposed of depending on different modes, right? Oftentimes, it's trucked out to the oceans and just dumped. Which is kind of a tragedy because all of that fertilizer is really useful. One simple example of that, New York City used to ship all of its treated municipal waste as fertilizer for the farms in upstate New York and in the various regions. And that was really beneficial for everybody involved. And then there was sort of a new sort of plan put in place that cut that off and ended up, they just now literally take it to the deep ocean and dump it. So we're kind of wasting all of that useful material. So what were the ramifications of that, right? It actually increased costs, right? Because now they couldn't sell the material to the farmers. They had to take on the additional costs. So it was kind of a weird choice to do, but that's the way it goes, right? Decisions are made. But when you add gasification, which is where you effectively, you don't burn the material in the traditional sense where there's combustion. What you do is you use catalysts without oxygen so that you convert all of that material into sort of the final product, but you capture all of the energy during that process. What you end up with is this material called biochar, which is virtually magical in all of the things that it can do, right? There's almost an infinite value for biochar when it comes to what you can do with it. So we literally can't make enough of this stuff. So to your point, the production of energy is not necessarily how you generate jobs. What it does is it acts as an enabler so that you can then generate jobs from many other industries, because now you have one of the key components that all of those industries will require. And I agree, data centers do not generate jobs, which is why many municipalities are actually resisting the opening of new data centers, because they consume so much power and so much water that it oftentimes actually harms the citizens living in those areas by higher electricity rates and higher water rates. This is a problem, and we got to resolve that problem, because AI, to your point, is an ever hungrier beast, right? We can never feed it enough. It will always want more. So in many ways, that will actually drive the adoption of renewables and green energy, because fossil fuels just can't keep up. Right? It's a stopgap for the short term, absolutely, because you can put those things into service really, really quickly. To your point, the natural gas line is absolutely driving a powered, power plant, and it is driving the vast majority of the power for that data center, no doubt.
Well,
but is that a long-term solution? Of course not.
I was going to say, Memphis, Tennessee had an XAI facility go in last year, or maybe it was in 24, but they put in 14 gas turbines, and I believe those are probably all about 25 megawatts each. So they're producing about 350 megawatts of electricity to run that facility. It's down on, it's sort of just south of downtown, a couple miles. It's right on the Mississippi River on a place called President's Island, which I never really understood. It never really seemed like it was an island. It might have been an island in the 1800s or something, but the Mississippi River, things change from time to time. Anyways, there's been a lot of uproar from the community that you've got this big polluter, burning natural gas right there in the Memphis city limits. And it's in a poor area of town, and not been a great corporate citizen. Now, I'm a big Elon Musk fan, okay, and I like what he's done with Grok and XAI and different things, because he's taken kind of a slightly different approach. I'm not a Grok user, but I admire some of the things that he's done, and but this one is kind of a little off. And it's funny because Musk is such a big proponent of solar. He sees solar as the end all of everything. And I get some of his reasoning, but it also could still be some of just his own condition, where maybe he gets infatuated with something. But anyways, to your point, it was certainly not something the city of Memphis that their local utility could have powered. So they use natural gas instead.
And
Exactly.
it's a crazy trend in the industry right now. And what I find really compelling about what you're talking about and looking at is we have like really reframed what a large load means in the power industry because of data centers. And we get focused on this and say we need hundreds of megawatts, and somebody on the outside of this conversation might hear you say that and say, whoa, these small towns, they need hundreds of megawatts. No, they don't. Traditional industry, manufacturing, it's singles of megawatts. At the most, it's tens of megawatts. It's really these smaller numbers that are out there that drive the economic engine. In these areas, it's not these giant data centers that are power hogs and consuming. We see it a lot with crypto, unfortunately, crypto mining, which is really, really coming out of vogue. But boy, those things are so mobile and so quick to put in. And from a utility perspective, it's, oh boy, I have a 24/7 load, that I can run, and anything excess, like we're just going to put it in there. So that's where I see the rub in a lot of these smaller communities that maybe had an excess megawatt or two. Crypto ran in and gobbled that out. And unfortunately, that excess megawatt or two, that was a furniture manufacturer, that wanted to go in there, or the local grain co-op that wanted to put a new facility in there that is all of a sudden gone. So we almost have to get out of this new headspace we've created where development has to be in hundreds of megawatts. And it's a handful of megawatts to a small community is a huge deal. And can create a lot of opportunity, and that's where the jobs are. It's not processing power, it's people power in a lot of those spaces that are supplementing it.
Mike, how much power does a grocery store, a full-size grocery
I would
store?
say, like, just rule of thumb reference, you think of a super center Walmart, with retail, freezers, groceries, everything like that, is about a megawatt. It's about a megawatt of load.
Yeah. Where on the flip side, that could support, in theory, 500 homes,
Yeah.
a couple thousand people.
Depending on the part of the country. Yep.
Yeah. It's interesting to see. I don't really, before I started doing this podcast, I didn't really know energy math that well. And I've learned an awful lot of energy math. And I'm going to just say that I would bet that, people who maybe watch our show might be knowledgeable on energy math. but I would bet that 95% of the population has no idea of how many megawatts are in a gigawatt and how many kilowatts are they don't realize it's 1,000 and times 1,000 times 1,000, and that we keep getting into some of these numbers and how big some of that gets and what it takes to produce jobs. And they just know they burn couple each day on their house, right? A couple of kilowatts, and it's a little bit that way.
Exactly. And that's where a lot of this comes into play, where pretty much any more power we can generate, we will find a use for. And we will find a use for it really fast. And so there isn't going to be a whole lot of, oh, I've got a whole bunch of, energy that I don't have a use for. That is very unlikely to occur. And, if you look, for example, in the Northwest, right, in the Seattle area, they get the spring thaw. And so their hydroelectric power is running at full blast, way above what can be possibly consumed. And so it ends up being more or less free. So the question is, well, what do you do with all of that, right? And so there's so many different choices you could use to make that valuable in a way that would benefit people. And that's the idea. So that looking at some of these towns in the Midwest, to your point, if you could create 50 megawatts, right, which is a very reasonable amount of power now with a combination of renewables and, geothermal and nuclear, 50 megawatts is not hard to do. That would be way more than that town would ever possibly consume itself. And therefore, you could then expand operations, to your point, pick the industry, pick a bunch of industries, put them all together. Boom, it now becomes that economic driver that allows for people to have hope. Because I think that's fundamentally what's happened in much of sort of the middle of America, is that people have lost hope because they are left behind. And we can't let that happen. That is unfair to them. They didn't deserve it. And now we need to start thinking about it and taking it more seriously. And I get that focusing on the large cities, there's a per capita value there. I 100% understand that, okay? And this is why you see things like high-speed internet connections being favored into regions of high, personal density. Got it. Makes sense. Of course, it's difficult and expensive to put this stuff in. Doesn't mean that it isn't worth doing. And so the question is, what can we do once we have an economic driver? And I think energy will always, always, always be valuable. I don't foresee a point where energy will be so infinite that it will have a cost of zero. So it will be an economic driver wherever it's produced. Why not produce it literally everywhere, right? The earth is bathed in sunlight. It has wind almost all the time if you go up high enough in altitude. Geothermal is always, the earth is always hot, and it's always going to be hot. These are things that you could never, consume completely, unlike fossil fuels, where at some point they will run out. And so at some level, all of these AI machines that are gobbling up energy like crazy, they're going to force us to go to a renewable system because there isn't enough fossil fuel left to drive this for very long. So we have to do it. And so we might as well start now, and we might as well benefit the groups that need it and start there.
What's really fun about this, and repeating myself a little bit from before, but this new energy model we have of localized resources also eliminates one of the major problems the grid has today of transmission infrastructure. And especially when we talk about these small communities, I mean, unfortunately, the hard reality is some of them are still fed by facilities that were constructed during rural electrification, in the 1920s and 1930s. And it is so limited in those spaces and what they're able to do. And the cost is astronomical today. And to your point and what you were just saying, people put pen to paper on that, in the finance and economic sense. no, like we are not going to rebuild all of, this 100 miles of infrastructure to support load in here. Put the generation where the load is. And you avoid that entire scenario and that entire problem. And that's, from my standpoint in the industry, that's where it gets so interesting, and turning it on its head. And the other part that's really interesting, I'm very protectionist of the grid. I spent my career doing grid planning and stay out of here, stay out of here, stay out of here. And especially people in finance and all of those areas and capital, like stay out of it. But it's excited to see people from a technical background start to approach it. And from those perspectives and a scientific background, and say, hey, this, what you have here is kind of interesting. I think things I've done in other spaces can start to apply to it. And especially when it's not motivated by dollars, necessarily from the outside, and investment dollars and what it looks like. We were trying to reinvigorate communities. We were trying to put these things in here from an altruistic sense, and revitalizing economies in those spaces. It's kind of cool to see people from these other technical backgrounds and scientific areas start to approach the grid, because it's the problem today. I mean, it's energy. I mean, it's like we've all been saying here, it's never not going to be an issue. So let's attack it. Let's get it local and really focus on it from all directions.
I would also say one real quick thing, David, to Mike. My understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that most of the legacy grids were never designed to have many input systems. They were largely designed around a single input or a small number of inputs with lots of outputs, right? They reached many locations, but they were generally driven off of a relatively small number of massive power plants for the input. As we switch to things like rooftop solar, as we switch to things like wind generation, all of these other inputs, the grids were never really built to manage all of that. And that is creating a lot of havoc with how those grids are built. And upgrading them to quote unquote smart grids is just an absolutely mind-boggling, eye-watering number. And I think that's the other challenge, is the legacy systems, we can't use them the way we want to now. They worked for when they were built, but now they don't work the way we want them to. So the question is, do we spend more time and effort on local generation and bypassing the grids? Or do we try to actually upgrade these grids so that they can function this way? I don't know the value of one versus the other. My gut says microgeneration at the need where the load is going to be more effective than trying to upgrade, huge swaths of grid that could be, thousands of square miles of actual material. But I welcome your input on that. I may be wrong.
No, you're 100% correct. And the analogy I use a lot of time, it's interstate system. And you've got cars flowing down, it's 5 lanes, it's big car, we know where we're going. Well, what happens when cars start to drive the other way, and you have head-on traffic? If it's just one car coming from the opposite direction going against flow, maybe people can avoid it. But when that one direction starts going both directions, it becomes really challenging along those systems. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of upgrades. I think what we're starting to see a little bit more in the industry is we have, on the local scale at least, maybe some more flexibility than we thought. And like I said, I'm a protectionist of the grid, and my job is to make sure the power doesn't go out for all those years. So it's absolutely not. You will not do that. You will not, nobody does that. Then you see somebody who tried it. It's like, kind of worked. It worked the way the model said it was going to, and in practice, it's starting to work. So we do have a little bit more flexibility in those spaces, but it's the big question of, should we keep building the grid the way we've built it for the past 120 years? Probably not. Those costs have gone down from localized generation. Now we still need transmission. We still need big honking machines. And without getting into too many of the details, kind of the phrase inertia-driven machines. it takes a big old honking generator to run a big old honking motor, or an arc furnace or things like that. So there's still a need for those centralized power plants, and just the dynamics of the grid. When you have multiple smaller sources, they don't respond as well to faults and different issues on the grid. You kind of shake the table a little bit and all the little things fall over, whereas you have a big thing in the center, you can shake the table a lot and it's not going to fall over. So there still is a need to have what we call in the industry inertia driven machines, and they're starting to introduce synthetic inertia, different things like that, to ride through those events. But similar to what you're saying, there's no reason on a local scale, homes, small businesses, small manufacturing, whatever that might be, that you can't localize that power. And especially when you're talking about small modular nuclear reactors, they're effectively providing that local inertia in there, that inverter based systems from solar, from batteries, everything like that they can't quite provide. So if you're coupling to more of some of those traditional sources, you get those ride through capabilities, and it makes a lot of sense in my head. It just makes a lot of sense the way those things would go, and not let's completely keep building the grid out the exact way we've done it, but double what we have in there, put all the new equipment in. We can localize this a lot more than we have in the past.
Look at a place like California, where they have all of the really cheap energy generation models. They've got wind, solar, all of that, yet retail electricity is what, 30 something cents a kilowatt hour. I mean, it's all because of the transmission, right? But the thing is, nobody, what is it, NIMBY? No, not in my backyard. People don't want the wind turbine in their backyard. They don't want the solar panels in their backyard. So California has them all hundreds of miles from where people live. And so that then they have all these transmission lines. And so it costs maybe 2 cents a kilowatt hour to produce wind energy, but they're selling it to the end customer for 35 because it took 30 cents in transmission costs. And it's just crazy to think that. And when you have, nuclear is going to be more expensive than wind, but let's say it's 9 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour. If it's right there where it's being used, it's kind of irrelevant if you're saving 25 cents on transmission. And
I'll chime in really quickly. So
Sure.
I live in a city called Alameda in the San Francisco Bay Area. Alameda is a municipal power system, so we are not associated with PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, which runs pretty much all of Northern California. And when you think about all of Northern California, you're talking about, thousands and thousands of square miles of grid. I mean, it is unreal how big PG&E's grid system is compared to virtually any other grid anywhere else in the country, right? So of course, but it's also extremely antiquated. And this is where the wildfire risk, et cetera, comes from. But Alameda is a municipal system, and it's 100% renewable since, I believe, 2019. And they did that through 85% geothermal and 15% biomass. And that's kind of how it works, which, again, is proof that a city that has nearly 100,000 people in it can be run off of a municipal system that is 100% renewable for now almost a decade. This is a doable thing. And we could use this model that clearly has been working here almost anywhere. And that's what I think could be really useful. And we got to think about it in that way, where, to your point, Mike, these big, very old legacy grids are just not really designed for what we want them to do now. And I think part of it was when they were put in, it was okay to lose a lot of power in the transmission because very little was electrified. So it didn't really impact people very much because you had maybe electric lights and maybe a single television and, some very basic, refrigeration and things of that nature, right? Appliances and such. But that was largely it. Now it's lots of computers, lots of electronic devices, maybe electrical vehicles. I mean, the demand on just the housing side has increased enormously from the 1970s, when most of these grids were built and put in. And that is a problem. And so, I'm not saying that the way Alameda did it is universally possible, but the concept, I think, is universally possible. And that's the way I would like to see a lot of the rest of the country doing this.
I'm surprised that we don't see more Alameda setups. If that was done 10 years ago, it's like it's proven, right? Why aren't we seeing more of those?
I think there, to Mike's point, there's inertia, right? Not just in the machines, but in the thinking. And I think that ultimately creates a big challenge because there's also the NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. And so you have to do it in a way that is acceptable to people. They much prefer to have it out of sight, out of mind, right? And that's pretty much how the grids were originally built, right? Put the power plants really far away because no one wants to think about them. And they don't want to see them, and they don't want the pollution, and they don't want the noise, and they don't want XYZ problem. But there was a trade-off there. And that trade-off was it's going to be more expensive to do it that way. And again, when we didn't electrify very much, okay, who cares? It was a modest cost. Now everything is electric, and then we want to switch everything else to electric, right? In California, they want to phase out natural gas powered appliances because of the nitrogen oxides that they produce when you burn it, because there's always some nitrogen compounds in the natural gas system. And those are extremely carcinogenic, and they contribute to one of the biggest sources of indoor pollution is from your natural gas powered stove, right? So, okay, you want to switch that out and get that out of the system. Okay, what's your alternative? Electricity. That's it. We don't have a choice. And so you're now electrifying things, but if you have like a tankless water heater and an induction stove, that could be like half of all of the power coming into your house are just those two appliances because it takes so much electricity to replace natural gas. And that's a problem, right? You're upgrading systems, you're upgrading services, and that is a big challenge that is, again, limitations due to availability of power. We got to just make power more available, period. And we can't overlook any particular source, but I would say that we need to move away from the fossil fuel driven systems because fundamentally those are limited, right? They will run out. And then you'll end up spending all this money to replace them. You might as well do it now while the transition will be relatively, I'm not going to call it painless, but definitely less friction.
Yeah, it's what's interesting about this whole situation is scarcity of power and electric energy is new. That's a new phenomenon within the past few years. Aging myself a little bit in the industry, but 10 or 15 years ago, we were in the opposite position of we have all of these assets built that are producing all of this power, and demand is decreasing. Lighting efficiencies, AC efficiencies, all of the appliance standards that keep getting passed, Energy Star and everything like that. We saw the phenomenon of an established part of town, homes have been around 20, 30, 40 years. They have a certain amount of demand that they have. Hey, this, the last resurgence we really saw in the grid that we dealt with was air conditioning, in the 60s and 70s and a little bit in the 80s. And we attacked it with brute force coal power plants and nuclear to get that through there. And we built these large assets, and over time, they were flat, and started to go down. Every time new SEER standards would come out and new AC would go into place, your energy envelope for your house goes down. So as a grid, we were kind of challenged with this of, one, we're being asked to replace fossil units for environmental reasons and carbon reduction. It's like, okay, we can kind of manage that. We know what we're doing a little bit. The demand's going down, but now within the past 5 years, it's skyrocketing. And it's not just the AI data centers, but it is that electrification. And that's one of the things I do, in my day job is how do you integrate electric vehicles into the grid? And what does that mean? And what does this actually mean for the grid and, you know, the inputs and everything that's happening in that space. So it's just it's a couple of things that are colliding all at once. And as an industry, we're kind of looking, you know, up, down, sideways, all over, and say, well, what do we do? You know, all of these pieces are moving at the same time. How do we make that as seamless as possible moving forward with the best outcomes that we want?
Mm-hmm. But I think we now have the opportunity to plan those outcomes versus reacting to those outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the difference. And that's why I think seizing on it now, when we do have a stable option for fossil fuels that can be deployed very, very rapidly to be able to solve these problems, but now we can have sort of that insurance policy of we have a fallback position if this takes longer than we think it does, versus waiting until the bitter end when everything is collapsing because we're running out and oil is hard to come by and natural gas is hard to come by and all of these sources are difficult and expensive. And now we're trying to do a transition really, really, really fast. And that's going to be extremely painful. And I think that, you know, yes, human beings are terrible at doing future risk. We are awful at it, but we can get in front of this. And I think now is a great opportunity to see the writing on the wall that no matter how much power we generate, it will never be enough. So we need to now think about how do we open that spigot so that as much as we possibly can create from whatever source we can legitimately create it from is what we do. And I think this is the opportunity that we need to seize before we end up in a position where now it's an emergency and everything is critical and, you know, we're watching everything collapse because we didn't plan it out ahead of time.
Great. David, any final thoughts before we're running out of time?
Sure. Well, first off, I do want to say thank you so much. You know, I hope my thoughts were of value for folks watching, and I do appreciate this opportunity. I recognize that my PhD is not necessarily in something along these lines, but I'll give you one really quick thing. You know, we think of fuel cells as a way to generate electricity, right? They use hydrogen and oxygen to produce water, but they don't use combustion to do it. And this is a really interesting idea. It powers most spaceflight, right? Is fuel cells. There are now bacteria and algae that have been modified genetically so that their waste product is not carbon dioxide, but actually hydrogen gas. And so they breathe out hydrogen gas now. And so you could imagine a system like that producing effectively infinite amounts of hydrogen gas from sources like sugar and water to be able, or even light, to be able to now produce hydrogen at scale. Because again, living things are infinitely scalable, right? You can always grow more of them. And imagine if that could be a source. So there's wild stuff that can be done with biology as well. And, you know, different ways that we've modified photosynthesis so that photosynthesis now produces electricity directly, right? So instead of capturing all of that to fix carbon, we can actually leverage that as the electrons that are being moved around by the cell that can now actually create voltage. And now you can create electricity from photosynthesis. These are the really cool things that we can do with biology. The problem is we don't know exactly how to scale that right now in a cost-effective manner. Is that the future? Probably, but not today. And so we got to think about this as what can we do today, but always keep a thought about what we can do in the future to make it even better. And one thing I would love to see is, you know, room temperature superconductors, right? We get to room temperature superconductors and transmission is no longer a problem. We just solve that problem instantly. We're not there yet, though. We get better every year, but we're not there. And so I'd love to see some of these innovations get a lot more focus because they would solve problems on a very grand scale really fast.
All right. Well, David, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. If you don't mind just hanging out with us for a minute while I say goodbye, everybody. Thanks for watching today. And I won't be back till next week with Bill on Tuesday. I'll be traveling on Friday. Anyways, thanks.